Welcome back, everybody, to the second episode of the Last of Us Nerds podcast. The first one recapping the show itself. I am your host, one of your hosts, Jacob. Joining me, as always, is Tom. We're going to be talking today about the pilot episode, When You're Lost in the Darkness. Before we jump into that, for those of you that didn't listen to last week's episode, just a quick kind of Cliff Notes version. Like I said, I'm Jacob. Tom joining me. We are two huge fans of the Last of Us game, nerds of the game, you could even say. And we decided to make this podcast to just discuss something that we love so much on a week-to-week basis. We're going to have spoiler, non-spoiler parts. Tom will explain all that, but the genesis is that we're coming at this from kind of a place of passion, loving the games throughout the years, and now getting a chance to watch the show itself is exciting. So we thought we would each week discuss what we think of the TV show, how it compares to the game, the changes they made, things like that along the way. Tom, first off, hello, and let everyone know kind of what these episodes are going to look like now that we're actually into recapping the show.
Hello. So I'm so excited to be here once again. So I want to make one thing abundantly clear from the jump. This is a podcast that is going to be safe for people that do not know the plot of the game and are watching along the show week to week, experiencing this story for the first time. We have a deep passion for the story, which is why we're doing this podcast. We're going to be discussing the show as an adaptation. We will provide highlights and insights of some of the most notable changes from the source of material, but most of the discussion week to week is going to be focused on the story, the characters, and the particular episode that we're on. So first, we'll give our general impressions of the episode, overall thoughts and feelings. Then we're going to dive deep on the story and characters, breaking down what happened this week with the plot, character analysis, and along the way point out some of the interesting ways the show is adapting or changing the source material. At the end of the podcast, we have a few fun things to do, and then we're going to have a clear spoiler break for people that are not familiar with the plot of both The Last of Us in 2013 and The Last of Us Part 2 from 2020. At that point on, we are going to be full speculating based on our knowledge of the game in terms of what to expect going forward, what we think is going to happen next, go a little bit further than we would for the first part of the audience into some more Easter eggy detail in terms of more specific changes from the game that we thought were fun or interesting. And at the end of each episode, we'll have some awards to give out. So first things first, what did we think about this episode? Jacob, why don't you talk to me a little bit about how you felt watching this episode? Did you like it?
I loved it. It was a long time we had to wait for this. They announced it multiple years ago. Not just waiting since then, waiting since we knew, since the trailers, since the release dates, the last few weeks as more interviews have come out, the last week as reviews have come out. My expectations were sky high, and even then they surpassed it. This was absolutely incredible. I've seen, I mean, as a fan of the game, obviously this was incredible. I've seen kind of reactions from people who are not or have not played the game that seemed to go in line with that as well. This was just a fantastic show, a fantastic pilot that, man, I am so excited about where the next month and a half, 2 months is going to take us. The amount of details they added without getting into the specifics is what probably blew me away most about this, but I absolutely loved it and just cannot wait to watch more of it.
Yeah, I think in terms of what you want out of an adaptation, they nailed it because, and granted, we reserve the right to change our mind if future things we don't like, but what they seem to be doing in a very thoughtful way is giving us all the core important moments that fans of the story want and would be annoyed if they didn't see, while still having so much more room to explore interesting different choices that they can make along the way. to flesh something out, to try something different, to expand on a character's motivations some more, or rethink a certain aspect of it. Uh, I'm so much more excited to see what is different going forward after this first episode, because I think we can feel pretty safely assured now that they're not going to mess up the most important, crucial things that we would have wanted to see as fans. And that's what's so exciting to me.
I just didn't. Did you expect this level of difference from the game? Like, we had
No,
35 minutes of the episode dedicated to Outbreak Day that I would say 75% of that just didn't exist in the game.
for sure. And especially I had seen some things in reviews about how like they're super faithful to the game, but some of the best moments are when they branch out and make different decisions. But they it's a tricky line to walk, and at least in this first episode, I feel like they did it really well while providing some really interesting and new things that we're excited to talk more in detail about, while still giving us what made The Last of Us The Last of Us. And that's a really fun place to be.
On the note of changes, we're going to start off breaking down this episode with a part that was created just for the show. So Tom, give us the synopsis of the prologue's prologue.
Yeah, so part one, right? Fungus. So in 1968, scientists are on a television talk show, one where they're still smoking cigarettes, discussing their fears of whether certain types of microorganisms pose an existential threat to humanity. They briefly discuss the idea of a pandemic, one that could jump from Madagascar to Chicago, spreading from coughing, spread through the air, humans spreading it on planes. But Dr. Newman is not most scared of a virus nor a bacteria, but rather a fungus. He says, quote, viruses can make us ill, but fungi can alter our very minds. They allude to cordyceps, which is a very real fungus that can control the minds and behaviors of ants, for example. One doctor dismisses the idea that this could happen to humans, and Dr. Newman admits that currently, in the 1960s, there would be no reason for a fungi to have to survive a temperature as high as the human's body temperature, but what if the Earth were to get hotter? The fungi would have a reason to evolve, and even worse, Dr. Newman shares the more disturbing forecast that should a fungi be able to evolve in this way, we would not be able to stop it. Jacob, what did you think of this very new change? This is not in the game at all. This is something completely invented for the show, this little prologue in the 60s.
Yeah, Craig Mazin creation for this. I think it did a couple of things to it served a very real purpose. I mean, for one, if you're doing a show in 2022 about an outbreak, there's a pretty big elephant in the room with COVID. So I think in some aspects, this kind of addressed that elephant in the room about COVID and an airborne virus and all that. It hit a little close to home, but I think that's just kind of going to be the nature of these types of shows for probably ever for those of us that went through COVID. But I also thought it was, I mean, if we're talking about hitting close to home, having a disease spread because of kind of alluding to global warming, it also hits a little close to home with the world warming up and fungi having to adapt, and that's what leads to this outbreak. Like you said, it wasn't something in the game, but I mean, right off the bat, we see something that is new to the show that is a great addition. It kind of sets the stage for how this disease comes about, and all while doing it in a way that, I mean, they immediately address kind of the elephant in the room in the first, I don't know, 3, 4, 5 minutes of the show.
Yeah, and I think it did a couple things that were very interesting. So obviously, I think you could feel Craig Mazin's fingerprints all over this. This is probably the most Chernobyl-y, the most Chernobyl-y scene I would have to think that the show's ever going to have. But it was really interesting in a way that it primes the audience for what's going to happen, the outbreak. It does a way to make it a little bit more interesting and differentiate it from just another zombie story, trying to set itself apart in that way a little bit earlier, because I do think some people have an earned zombie fatigue, and this was a good way to sort of set their expectations that it's going to be slightly different. Um, I'm sure there's someone that's already super mad about the global warming part. I don't think they're trying to make this show about global warming part. It's just a fun little thing to put in the back of the mind of what if humans could cause something like this as well. Makes it a little bit more topical in today's day and age. But overall, I just thought it was a really interesting way to start off the show, to put the audience a little bit on edge for the second part of Outbreak Day.
The challenge, as you kind of said, with like zombie fatigue is making it feel like this type of outbreak is possible. And they did that in a number of ways. The show isn't about global warming, but I mean that is how they kind of allude to how this happens, which feels real. And as you said, cordyceps is real. So like there's a lot of things in this that hit close to home and that this is all very theoretically possible. It sets a kind of an ominous tone too from the get-go, that all of this is very possible and could happen one day. And as we see in the show, it does happen on Outbreak Day. Before we get your thought or get your synopsis on Outbreak Day, after the prologue, we get the credits, the opening credits. I am not as much of an intro guy necessarily as I know you are. I would watch the Game of Thrones intro a couple times and then just skip right over it most of the time. There is no chance I am ever skipping over this Last of Us intro.
Well, first of all, I'm shocked and appalled that you skipped the Game of Thrones intro credits. That was also a great one, but no, the intro credits were amazing. We have to shout out Gustavo Santaolalla. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. I believe I am. Who was the original composer on The Last of Us and The Last of Us Part 2. They brought him back for this show. They use a lot of the same themes. This theme that plays over the credits is almost the exact same musical arrangement that is played in the game. We get it at different parts. In the game, we get it after the end of Outbreak Day, when tragedy strikes, and here we're getting it before that, because obviously they spend a lot more time on Outbreak Day than they do that. But if we were doing an over under on when Tom would have first teared up on this show, the underbetters would have thrived, because they did the prologue. I'm like, oh, that's interesting, and the credits hit, and that music kicks in, and just immediate reaction in my eyes. And part of that is just, I've been listening to that music for so long, and obviously we have a deep emotional attachment to it. But also part of it is when that music, that same theme plays in the game, something very tragic had just happened before that. And obviously, like we talked about, we'd spent a lot of time watching other people's reactions to that. So that's the music that's playing as we're watching other people process all that. We just have some very deep emotions tied to that music. I thought it was perfect. I love the little fungal animations they did with the credits, especially at the end when the two little itty bit tendrils turn into what are clearly resembling Joel and Ellie walking down a road. I thought it was perfect. I thought it was great. Yeah, no, I'm not skipping that.
Yeah, it got a little bit of a gasp from me when I realized what the song was, and perfect choice, perfect guy to have in charge of the score. Very excited for that part alone. But after we see Joel and Ellie, we cut to Outbreak Day. Talk us through part 2, the prologue of Last of Us.
The year is 2003, and in Austin, Texas, we meet Joel, Sarah, and Tommy Miller. Joel, who's played by Pedro Pascal, is a single dad working a blue-collar construction job. Sarah, who's played by Nico Parker, is his teenage daughter, and Tommy, played by Gabriel Luna, is Joel's little brother, and to Sarah, her Uncle Tommy. They're clearly very close. They lean on each other to get by. It's Joel's birthday, and Sarah takes Joel's broken watch and some money from his desk to go get it fixed. She doesn't have any money to actually buy him a nice gift, but she can take the time to do something for her dad that she knows he won't take the time to do for himself. So Joel actually ends up working until 10 p.m. on his birthday. After school, Sarah gets Joel's watch fixed at a local shop. As a woman rushes the shopkeep to finish up and close the shop early, she urges Sarah to go home. As Sarah borrows a DVD from their neighbor's shelf, a wheelchair-bound Nana, the grandmother of the neighbors, begins to twitch and lurch. A very good dog named Mercy is staring and softly whining at Nana, and Sarah leaves, uneasy, When will people learn to trust the dogs? We'll discuss that later. But Joel gets home late. Sarah has been waiting for him. She gives him his birthday gift. His watch is fixed, and they fall asleep on the couch watching Curse and Viper 2, a cheesy action movie. Joel geeks out over this being the version with the deleted scenes. Sarah falls asleep. Joel gets a call. Tommy's in jail. Not for the first time, it seems, but he swears it was not his fault this time. We can later infer that an infected had started attacking a waitress, and Tommy had stepped in and knocked him out. Joel carries Sarah to her bed and leaves to go bail Tommy out of jail. 2 hours later, Sarah wakes up to various noises. Things are escalating. Helicopters are overhead. Dogs are barking. An emergency alert urging people to stay inside is being played on the TV. And Mercy the dog is begging for Sarah to let him in. Ever the good neighbor, Sarah tries to get Mercy back to his home, but he refuses to go and ends up running away. Sarah walks in to find that Nana is now an infected, a zombie-like creature that was theorized in that 1968 prologue, a human body controlled by a cordyceps, a parasitic fungus, which is intent on attacking humans with the goal of spreading the infection to every viable host. The previously borderline vegetative Nana has sprung up, in some ways has been healed by this infection at the cost of something much greater. She's killed her family and is running towards Sarah next. Sarah runs out to the street. Joel and Tommy arrive in the truck. Tommy's armed with a rifle, Joel's armed with a wrench, and as Nana sprints towards Joel, he does not hesitate, killing Nana, his first infected, with the wrench. As they're about to take off in the truck, Joel tells another neighbor, Denise, to get in the house and lock her doors. Joel drives through an infected in the street. Denise, oblivious, runs out to help the infected that just got run over, thinking her neighbor just ran over someone in the street. And needless to say, she's not going to be in The Last of Us Season 2. The Millers frantically drive, trying to find a way to get out, leave Austin, go anywhere. But Sarah asks the right question: what do they do if it's everywhere? They drive by a family with a kid who are begging them to stop the truck and help them. Tommy thinks they should stop. They got a kid, Joel. So do we. Keep driving. Sarah notes they had room in the back of the truck. Somebody else will come along, Joel says. He's not going to risk it. The highway they're trying to get to is jammed, and people are driving the wrong way. Desperation intensifies. They try off-roading to get to the highway, but there's a full-on military blockade. They drive north, their only option left, to a crowded part of the suburb with nowhere else to go, and it's chaos. Infected are everywhere. Things are on fire. People are running and screaming in the streets before a large airliner crashes into the street. The truck crashes. Sarah's ankle is too hurt to walk on, and Tommy gets separated, needing to find another way around. Joel frantically carries Sarah in his arms, running from an infected, until a soldier shoots it down. Finally, they've gotten to the highway, and they think they're safe, but they're wrong. This was Outbreak Day, the day it all went wrong. And the military is not interested in protecting 1 or 2 human lives. They're not even interested in protecting the entire population of Austin, but rather containing the outbreak. If need be, eliminate the few to save the many. Joel pleads that they aren't sick, but the soldier fires his assault rifle, and Joel and Sarah topple to the ground. The soldier doesn't want to do it, but he's following his orders. He walks to an injured Joel and says that he's sorry, while lining up a killing blow. But Tommy and his rifle get there first, shooting the soldier and saving his big brother's life. But if Tommy hadn't shown up, Joel would have been spared the ultimate pain that would go on to define the rest of his life. Sarah's been fatally shot in the abdomen. She's not going to make it. You're going to be okay, Joel lies to his daughter and to himself. He tries compressing the wound. He tries getting her up. It's not working. She's in pain. She's dying, and he can't fix it. He has her look away from the wound, just as he had her not look at the infected. Joel is living his worst nightmare, and it has nothing to do with the creepy fungal zombies. He could not protect his daughter. Tommy is motionless, accepting what Joel has not yet. Tommy, help me, Joel cries, but it's too late. She's already gone.
Heartbreaking. Like it is unbelievably powerful. No matter how many times I watch it, whether a game, whether on the TV show. Let's start back at the beginning of that. We're introduced to the Millers right away, and you kind of see the family dynamic this trio really has. This unique kind of family that they have with Joel, Tommy, and Sarah, they're all codependent on one another. It's Sarah that wakes up first to wake her dad up to tell him that his alarm's going off. He slept through it in a way that you can tell she's had to do that before. Um, she's the one making breakfast. It is his birthday, and you then see Tommy come in talking, and Joel even mentions it. He doesn't love me. He depends on me. There's a difference. Kind of joking with him. It's all those kind of little things that we didn't see in the game, certainly not nearly to this degree. So it's a very interesting look at how this little family lives day to day.
Yeah, and we get so many examples of their codependence on each other. You mentioned those, but there's also Tommy clearly needs Joel for structure and support. Joel's clearly had to bail Tommy out of jail before. That's a problem. We got to work on that, Tommy. Tommy and Sarah exchange similar looks to the idea of Joel working straight through his birthday. Tommy and Joel are oblivious to what Jakarta is. Sarah is the book smart one, and Tommy's like, "Oh, there's hope for us yet." But she also will do things like forgetting to lock the door when she leaves the house, or leaving eggshells in the eggs when they're cooking. So it's a very interesting dynamic that I'm glad we got to spend a little bit of time with. And I think that idea is obviously something that this story is very interested in exploring of, can you be codependent on other people for a long period of time without loving them? Is that what love is? I think those are some very interesting ideas that we'll probably have more to say about later. But I love this dynamic between the family, and I love that we got to spend more time with them.
You see how independent Sarah has to be within this kind of family dynamic. She's the one cooking breakfast. She's the one who told her dad to go get pancake mix that he forgot. She's the one that takes the watch into town to fix. She's just this very strong, independent 12-year-old. She's had to be because of the situation she's in. You get a little foreshadowing at breakfast of Joel kind of glancing at where his watch should be on his wrist. That watch is very important in the story moving forward. It's always on his wrist from that night forward, and you see it later on in the show when Ellie tells him it's broken, but it's always there. But it is a great look at this fun little unique little family that they have that, again, you don't see in the game. We're then introduced to the infected. First, I have to say, the scene of Nana Adler being infected behind Sarah as she's looking for a movie was unbelievable. One of my favorite shots of the episode. Just this woman who you've seen a couple times is very clearly wheelchair bound, cannot move, basically. For her to move in the way that the zombies eventually do in the background as Sarah's looking for Curtis and Viper 2, it is unbelievable. Just great cinematography, just great film work, and it is incredible to see, again, another addition to the show. But this is our first introduction to what the virus is, or the disease is, in the show. There's a notable difference between the game and the show. In the game, it is spores, and it can be airborne. And in the show, it is tendrils, which is kind of more of a hive mind type of thing. We don't know a lot about it yet. I'll first ask, just what do you think of that change? And I mean, we see it with Nana later on with the tendrils kind of coming out of her mouth.
I overall like it. I think it accomplishes a few different reasons. One, going back to making them different than a lot of zombies we've seen before. It is gross. It is creepy. It is scary. I think obviously when talking about COVID, probably one reason they didn't want to have to do spores is they probably didn't want to constantly remind people of this deadly virus that you'd be inhaling. That if you get it, you might start coughing. But yeah, in the game you can inhale this. And sorry, I shouldn't say virus. It's not a virus. It's a fungus, right? But I think that's a smart change. I think that's a very interesting visual change for us to see. We're only getting the first type of infected in this episode, and I'm sure we'll get more very soon. But that Nana looked scary. She looked creepy. It was a pretty scary choice to have the first infected we meet be someone that was wheelchair bound. Again, I don't want to assume what her conditions were, but obviously she wasn't all there. She was practically vegetative. To see that body lurch forward in the way that it does when the infected is in action was quite an interesting choice. But we also did find a interesting theory from Reddit that we think is probably correct. Now, this is in our non-spoiler section because this is not based on any game knowledge whatsoever. This appears to be a show thing, but people have deduced that, and if you don't want to hear anything, go ahead, skip forward 60 seconds. This is just a theory for what we think the infection started the infection, basically. We think it might be based on flour or some type of wheat or grain that got contaminated. In the game, we get a very brief snippet of a newspaper that Sarah grabs as she's walking through the house saying that this infection might be tied to contaminated crops. And there's just too many coincidences in this episode that have the main characters avoiding eating objects with flour. I want to shout out Anagnost, I believe is the name on Twitter. Sarah has no flour for pancakes, so they make eggs. They refuse the biscuits that the neighbors are offering them. Joel claims he's on the Atkins diet. Couldn't tell if that was true or if that was something he just said to avoid having to go over there and talk to the neighbors. Sarah doesn't take any cookies because of the raisins. Joel forgets to get a birthday cake. And then at one point, the mom neighbor was like spoon feeding Nana something. And she's like, "Oh, you like it? It's green." I'm like, "What are you spoon feeding her that's green?" So I was wondering if it was a contaminated crop there. And then in the official in the official HBO podcast with Troy Baker, Craig Mazin, and Neil Druckmann, they mentioned there's a lot of breadcrumbs in the first episode that might pay off later. So that seems like a pretty good theory.
It just so happens the world's largest flour mill is in Jakarta, which is, we hear on the radio, is where things are going south, to say the least.
I had not even seen that part yet. Wow. Okay, there you go. So yeah, that's really interesting. I love that little detail.
Pretty good shot that is how the virus or disease fungus starts. Back to the story. I have to note, I forgot to, Mrs. Adler saying 3 nails plus 1 cross equals 4 given got an audible laugh out of me because 100% my mom had a shirt that said that on it. A great choice to show what this virus can do. And as you kind of said, almost heals her. And then she is chasing Sarah down. So a powerful way to show how dangerous this virus is. Let's talk a little bit about Joel, because we get a lot of small details early on to key us in on who Joel is. He very clearly keeps a close, small circle. We only ever see him kind of talking to Tommy and Sarah, the neighbors outside. But outside of that, it doesn't seem like he has any friends. Nobody's kind of reaching out to him. There's no party scheduled for his birthday. In terms of that close circle, there's nobody he trusts to split the job with other than Tommy, even if it means that he's going to have to work like a double shift and some, basically, by the end of the day. So he keeps this very tight-knit circle, which is a theme that's going to carry on throughout the rest of the show, as it did throughout the game. There was no hesitation for him having to work straight through his birthday either. So this very kind of focused, kind of one-track mind type of guy that, he's got to provide, and he's going to do kind of whatever it takes to do so.
And I think the moment that most clearly showed you where Joel's compass is at is when they pass the hitchhikers on the road. This is a moment straight from the game that they pass these people on the road, and it's not even a question for Joel. He doesn't stop to think for a second. Okay, what do these guys need? Maybe we should see if they're okay. He is in full protector mode. He's not going to risk anything. They have a car. They have the 3 of them in there. They're not going to stop for anything. That shows you where his moral compass is at. That shows you where his priorities are at. And I think it's so interesting that the other 2 characters in the car are like, what we should see what they need. They have a kid. And Joel is solely focused on protecting his daughter and his brother. But it's not even, it's not a moral quandary for him. There's no decision to be made. It's already been made for him because that's just who he is. He's not going to risk that. I think that does such a good job of showing you who Joel is very early on.
Yeah, as I wrote down, he protects his. Like, if you're in that small circle, he has you, and that we see with his thoughts on the hitchhikers. And on that note of passing them by, we get kind of one of the iconic sequences from the game, with them in the car trying to find a way out, driving down the country roads, trying to get on the interstate, trying to drive through a town. It all ends up the same in the long run, but there were some differences in parts of this. I'll ask you, what aspects from kind of the game do you think they did well with this specific kind of, I don't want to call it a car chase, but this scene in the car?
Pretty much the whole thing is almost straight from the game. This truck sequence. This is obviously the most impressive action sequence that they've done so far, very early on through one episode. But I have to imagine this is going to rival anything they do throughout the rest of the show in terms of pure action. But they did it very well. I had a couple people that say this almost felt kind of like a video game of just the perspective you had in the car. But it was such a cool. They had a one shot going for a long time there. It was such a really interesting perspective of the action sequence of you're just on this one shot, you're in a car, you're moving fast, lots of stuff is happening as you're seeing it. There's zombies in the streets. Nope, that's not working. We got to back up. Oh, there's a plane behind us. We got to go forward. It did such a good job of capturing the chaos that was happening, obviously on Outbreak Day, and what would happen in that type of situation. But yeah, I thought they crushed that.
My favorite part of it is that so much of it took place in the back seat like it did in the game. That's not a game spoiler. In the game, you also basically have the exact same viewpoint of the entire scene, where you're sitting basically seeing what Sarah is seeing, looking out the front of the car, which is a great way to show you how tense the whole situation is, of them trying to find a way out and there not being one, basically.
Yeah, and we should say, so in this first part of the game, one thing they do really well is showing us everything in the show from Sarah's perspective, because she is the first POV character we get in the game. She's the first person you control. You wake up as Sarah, probably around that 2 a.m. mark equivalent in the show of when things are starting to happen. And they do a great job of effectively making her the protagonist for this prologue, which is the case for the game. So I thought they did an excellent job of building that over. We should know this is probably the biggest difference, is just how much time we got before shit started to hit the fan with the family. That's by far, I would say, the biggest difference in the Austin sequence, is just getting to spend more time. Pretty much everything that happens from Joel coming home and giving the watch to Sarah is almost straight from the game. And they did that in such a good way. And that's one of the most iconic moments from this original story, was that first 20 minutes or so of gameplay where you briefly get introduced to Joel and Sarah. You see their dynamic. Shit hits the fan. They try to get out, ending in Sarah's death. So I think we got to talk about that moment. It's the big moment of the episode. In some ways, it's one of the big moments of the series. Sarah's death. We again should obviously note that this was such a keystone iconic moment from the source material, that if they would have gotten this wrong, or if it would not have hit as hard as it does in this 2013 PS3 video game, a lot of people would have been really upset. And we gotta say, they nailed it.
Yeah,
they captured what that moment was and all the important beats of it, and it's they crushed that, and they had to. Pedro Pascal, that's what gives me more confidence than anything, is him in that moment. Nico Parker, we should shout her out again. Found out she's Thandie Newton's daughter. Didn't know that before, like yesterday. That's interesting. You can see it. She looks a lot like her. But all the performances in this prologue were amazing. Also, Gabriel Luna as Tommy literally sounds exactly like Jeffrey Wright did in the game. He sounds perfect, and he's from Austin, so that accent obviously comes very naturally to him. But Jacob, how did you feel reliving that moment once again?
this is my Molotov hot take. This I think is perhaps a more powerful death than in the game. Sarah's death in the show is more powerful than it is in the game because of what we've been saying. You get 35 minutes with Sarah, with Joel, with Tommy. You build even more of a bond with these people. And then to have it ripped away the way it is, like, it's brutal. It is heartbreaking. Hats off to Nico Parker. This was a tough role to play because you're going to get half of a show to half of an episode to make us fall in love with you. As you said, she's the main protagonist for the first 35 minutes of this show. And then she gets ripped away from us is what makes this so heartbreaking. And it's unexpected. It hurts no matter, but I mean, it hurts no matter if you expect it or not. Like it's just, they absolutely nailed it. As you said, this is one of those things that they had to get right from the game. It was a home run. They hit it out of the park. There was a lot of callbacks during the whole scene. We'll talk about those a little bit later, but everything about this was great. And it connected. It connected in a way I think, like I said, was more powerful than the game itself. So it was expertly done. It sold me on everybody. I didn't need to be sold anymore, but as you said, the Tommy and Joel were incredible in this scene. Nico is unbelievable. Just all around, hats off to all three of these, because this is a difficult scene that I told you I can't imagine. This is the type of scene I can't imagine doing multiple takes on. And the way these three nail it, that's a moment they had to get right, and they did.
So we go from there, just a small time jump. 20 years later, we jump from 2003 to 2023, alternate present day, from Austin, Texas to Boston, Massachusetts. Humanity is still around, barely. A young boy gets infected and is euthanized by Fedra, who's a military regime imposing martial law that is currently in control of the Boston quarantine zone. An older, grayer Joel is doing various work for ration cards, the currency of this zone. His coworker is unable to throw the body of the infected, euthanized boy into the fire. It's too much for her. She taps Joel on the shoulder. Joel does it without issue. He doesn't seem to dwell on it. You can see signs are lining the street with warnings of signs of infection, consequences for breaking curfew or any laws. Hint, it's execution. We immediately see public executions are happening for unauthorized exit exit from and entry to a quarantine zone. Joel meets Lee, who's played by Max Montesi, who is a dirty cop Fedra soldier who's buying opioids off Joel, who we learn is a smuggler in Boston. They also have a deal to get Joel a truck to get out of Boston. He already knows he has a deal in place for the battery. Lee warns Joel to stay off the streets for the next few nights because the Fireflies, a revolutionary group, which is looking to restore democracy and reclaim some previous semblance of society, and Fedra, who is that military regime, are openly engaged in armed conflict. We meet Joel's partner / boss, Tess, who is now played by Anna Torv, who's another hardened survivor who's being detained by Robert, a ponytailed fuckboy who stole the car battery that Joel needed to someone else. His goons have battered Tess, and Robert is afraid to let Tess go because he is scared of what Joel will do to him. Tess promises she won't have Joel hurt Robert, and Robert agrees to let her go just as an explosion blows up the room from the conflict and Robert runs away. We find out that Joel has not heard from Tommy, who is still alive, via radio, who is all the way in Wyoming. He hasn't heard from him in 3 weeks. He's convinced that Tommy will be dead if he does not get to him. He needs that truck and he needs that battery to go find his brother. We see Joel plotting a way west out on a map. He mixes some pills with alcohol before going to sleep and clearly dreaming about that awful night 20 years ago, the night that continues to haunt him. Tess comes in late, joins him in bed, and in the morning, Joel is immediately upset by the appearance of Tess's battered face. Tess is expecting this reaction. She asks him to calm down before telling him the whole situation. Clearly, she knows Joel well and knows that he will be protective, knows of his apparent issues with regards to this type of stuff. And Tess says, quote, "I promised Robert that you wouldn't hurt him, but I would very much like for you to hurt him." And they head out to hunt Robert down. So one interesting tidbit here is, and we actually misled our dear listeners in the last episode when we said we thought that this was a 10-episode season, which it initially was. And we find out on the official Last of Us podcast that the moment where we cut to 20 years later and Joel is dumping the kid in the fire is apparently where they initially cut the first episode. I mean, I guess we get like one shot of Ellie glancing out the window, and that's pretty much it. And apparently the executives at HBO gave him some feedback that, hey, this is great and the rest of the show is great, but this first episode might not leave you wanting to come back. That's kind of depressing with, not much where to go from there. And obviously The Last of Us is a very sad and tragic show, but I thought that was a very interesting tidbit. Jacob, what would you think of the first segment of Boston Quarantine Zone?
I mean, you're immediately shown the brutality of the situation with this young child they find wandering around that is then dumped into a burning pit by Joel, and you see the reality of what Joel has become as well, that he is just kind of this hardened version of himself. He has no problem dumping this body into the fire because his mindset is basically do whatever it takes to survive, and this is what it takes. He has to work through this type of stuff day in and day out. He doesn't care. I mean, he signs up to work in the sewers, basically. He doesn't really care what the job is. It's just whatever helps him stay alive.
The show does a lot of good examples through one episode of show don't tell, which is obviously a classic storytelling, tenet, rule, guideline to live by. But just that notion of that simple act of Joel just casually picking up a body of a dead kid and dumping it in the fire. They obviously thought long and hard about that, and that's probably the single best way in a short amount of time they could clearly convey that Joel's changed. This is not, he's still there, but this is not the same guy that we just met before this time jump. He is hardened. He has closed himself off. He doesn't want to get hurt again by those feelings, and it's just easier to be this way. Pedro obviously had a very different type of performance in this part versus in the prologue in Austin. He looks traumatized. At times he looks like he's in deep pain, and at other times his expression is almost a little vacant, like he's just not 100% there because he's distracting himself in his mind. The Fireflies say in this episode title, when you're lost in the darkness, you look for the light, and Joel's cool with the darkness, man. He's like, nah, you know what? It's nice here. It's comfy. We got some shade. I found a life here that has kept me closed off and alive, and I don't have to think about that very much, except for when I go to sleep. He is completely closed off.
We also obviously learn about the quarantine zone, the QZ, where it is positioned as Fedra versus the Fireflies. The Fireflies are referred to, I mean, even Ellie calls them terrorists at one point. That's kind of how the people in the QZ are it's what they're teaching them about the Fireflies, that they're the bad guys and Fedra are the good guys. It's up for interpretation, as we'll see throughout the show, but it's it's martial law. There's executions for leaving the quarantine zone, for illegally coming into the quarantine zone. Like, there are very strict rules that these people have to live by. And we also learn that Joel and Tommy aren't together anymore. Tommy is not in this quarantine zone, but Joel is urgently trying to get in contact with Tommy. There's some sort of falling out that has happened between the two of them. Tommy is all the way in Wyoming now, and Joel is trying to message him. It had been quite some time, I think 3 weeks, since he last heard from him. And we find out toward the end of the show that Joel blames Marlene in the Fireflies for turning his brother against him. It's a very different kind of situation Joel finds himself in the quarantine zone. He is shut off from everyone, in that close circle that he has, or had, I should say, isn't even that doesn't exist at this point. The only person he's letting in really right now is Tess, who We find out again as his partner, the probably one person he trusts at this point in his life. What are your thoughts as Anna Torv as Tess as we are introduced to her here in the QZ?
She seems great. Tess is a badass, which was well established in the game, but it's she has a very fun performance here. I think she's gonna be a very interesting character to watch going forward. The Tess and Joel relationship is very interesting. I want to see more from that because she almost is like treating him like a child that she knows is going to be very upset, and obviously that comes from a place of love and understanding his trauma and the way that Joel reacts. But it's also like, is she using Joel? Like, is she just like, obviously he's her muscle, but I think that's a very complex and complicated relationship, which the game explores a little, and I get the feeling the show is going to explore a lot. But I'm excited to see where that goes from there. I also think very quickly I want to mention this is where we're getting a big change from the game in terms of Joel's motivation for setting off on this adventure.
Yep.
I think this is a really good change because in the game, uh, Tess and Joel just hunt down Robert, who has made off with one of their shipments of guns that they have paid for and were going to smuggle and sell to others. And they hunt Robert down, who reveals that he's sold the guns already to the Fireflies. And Tess and Joel kill Robert there because he's no longer of any use to them. That's obviously not what happens here, and we'll get into what happened with Robert here in a second. But this motivation of Joel wanting to get out to go find Tommy because he's convinced he's going to die without him there is a lot more interesting than, okay, we're going to do this mission for the Fireflies so we can get our shipment of guns back. I think that was a smart choice, and I totally get where they were coming from on that.
Yeah, I very much like that choice. In the game, that storyline with Robert also kind of serves as your introduction to the game mechanics. So it, I guess, in some ways, couldn't be as complex of a storyline. And so in the the show, this was a much tighter way of tying all these parties together, and it was another good, not just a good addition, but a good change that they've made to the show. We are then introduced to the one and only Ellie. Tom, talk to us about Ellie.
Part 4, Ellie. You probably heard the name if you heard of The Last of Us. The Fireflies, led by Marlene, who is portrayed by the original actress from the game, by the way, Merle Dandridge, are holding a teenage girl named Ellie prisoner, and they're having to do a series of tests that involve counting to 10, sticking out her left hand, other things. Ellie is 14 years old. She's only ever known the life of after the outbreak. She never knew her parents. It's revealed that Marlene is the one that actually made sure Ellie was safe at Fedra's military school for orphans. We don't yet know why, but Marlene reveals that the Fireflies have a plan. They're trying to distract Fedra, leave as a group, take Ellie out west. Marlene tells Ellie, who is understandably upset and frightened about being detained, that she has a greater purpose than the Fireflies could have possibly imagined. The scene cuts before a crucial truth is revealed, one that we won't learn until Joel does, and Tess and Joel track down Robert. Before they find him, they find the corpse of an infected that is fully grown into the wall with disgusting and beautiful fungal growth that looks straight out of the game, only to find him already dead. He tried to sell the car battery, which was no good, to Marlene, resulting in an off-screen shootout that killed Robert, injured Marlene, and decimated the Firefly crew. Joel is jumped by Ellie, who has a knife. Joel disarms her, and the two do not seem to take very kindly to each other. Marlene knows why Joel needed the battery. Joel is convinced that Marlene and the Fireflies turned Tommy against him, which you mentioned, which Marlene dismisses hilariously with an "okay, Joel." But Marlene is now in a rough spot. She has to get Ellie out, but she's hurt. Her crew is decimated, and in desperation, she turns to Joel and Tess, whom she is familiar with and knows what they're capable of, quote, for better or worse. Ellie, voice of the audience, is fascinated by that. What are they capable of? We're not going to find out just yet. If Joel can get Ellie to the old state house, the Fireflies will give Joel what he needs. Not just a battery, but a whole fueled up truck, guns, and supplies to venture west to go get Tommy. Ellie quickly cracks the code of Joel's radio that he has to communicate with individuals named Bill and Frank. The radio playing a 60s song, meaning they don't have anything new in terms of supplies. 70s, they got new stuff, and she tricks Joel into revealing that 80s means trouble. Ellie notices that Joel's watch is broken, the same one Sarah had once fixed for him 20 years ago. Ellie has never left the Boston quarantine zone, and she's scared. She looks to Joel for reassurance that they'll be fine, and for the briefest of moments, the facade breaks, and Joel tells her that they will be. Joel wonders why it is that Ellie is so important. As Joel, Tess, and Ellie are sneaking out of the quarantine zone, they run into Lee, the dirty cop character. Joel and Tess try to negotiate with him to let them go. They'll split the ration cards with him. They'll give him all the ration cards if he lets them go. He barters further and is continuing to negotiate as he procedurally scans them, each testing them for signs of infection. Joel and Tess both go green, indicating they're clear. And as Lee scans Ellie, she stabs him. Lee grabs his gun, ready to shoot Ellie, but Joel jumps in the way. He flashes to that night, and we see one more image of Sarah and that soldier pointing the gun at him. A soldier is standing in front of him with his gun pointed at a little girl. Instinct takes over, and Joel brutally beats Lee to death. And we can see Ellie is transfixed watching it happen. She's never had a protector like this before. She likes it? Maybe? We'll probably find out more. Tess grabs the scanner that Lee was using on Ellie. It's flashing red. She's infected, but she isn't. Ellie appears to be immune. She was bitten, but she claims it was 3 weeks ago and is showing no signs of infection. But there's no time to discuss. Joel, Tess, and Ellie have to hurry to get away from Fedra, through a boundary fence, leaving the quarantine zone, and heading into a downtown area. Back at Joel's apartment, the radio from Bill and Frank plays the 1987 Depeche Mode song, Never Let Me Down Again. And 80s means trouble. As the music plays, we can see through a flash of lightning that two skyscrapers have collapsed on each other. And just before the credits roll, we hear, and if you look closely, you can actually see the source of some ominous clicking and screeching, teasing the horrors that will almost assuredly await in episode 2.
Clickers are horrifying in every medium that they are on. We're introduced to Bella Ramsey as Ellie for the first time here. I think she does a great job as Ellie. It's the small things. It's her yelling motherfucker. It sounds exactly like Ashley Johnson and Ellie in the game. It's just those small little mannerisms and moments that she absolutely picked up on, and she is Ellie. She's funny, she's kind of spunky, but she is maybe a little bit angrier than the Ellie we know in the game. We don't have a lot of sample size, I guess, to go on with Ellie, but from what we've seen so far, this seems a lot like the Ellie we've seen in the video games.
Yeah, so that's my one note. This is the main thing with both Pedro and Bella that I'm excited about, which is you can see the core of the characters, but they're a little different in a few different ways. And one thing I'm wondering about is this maybe an angrier Ellie than Ashley Johnson's Ellie? But I think part of that we'll have to wait and see, because it would obviously be understandable with someone that is being detained and forced to go places against her will and is scared and among other things, that she would be a little angry, or that she would process her emotions in a way like that. So I'm not sure on that yet. I want to see more. But the aspect I'm most intrigued about with Ellie that appears to be different, at least as far as I've processed from the show, is how that look she gave when Joel was beating the shit out of Lee.
Yeah.
That is definitely not like the Ellie from the game, and I'm not complaining about that. I'm interested to see where that goes. But you never see like a visceral reaction in that way of Ellie to violence in the game, and most of the time just Joel kills someone brutally and you just hear Ellie over your shoulder go, holy shit, or something like that. But this is a little different. I'm very interested to see where they go from that. Jacob, what did you make of that choice? Where do you think they're going with that?
I mean, it was, again, from a cinematography standpoint, her like sliding over as lightning is striking with this, it was a smirk on her face, was noteworthy. As you kind of said, it was very interesting to see. We don't ever really see Ellie when you're beating up people in the video game. But as you said, we get the little one-off lines throughout. So maybe it is something similar. We just see it this time versus hear it, but it was certainly different. And if you compare it to Sarah early on in the show, when Joel has to kill Nana Adler as she's being chased down, Sarah's mortified and crying, and as like a normal person probably would. And when now it is Joel killing, and not even a zombie, just a human, Ellie is appears to like it. There's a smirk on her face. I think to a certain degree, Ellie likes having someone defend her like this. I don't know how many times she's had that in her life to this point. So it's an interesting dynamic that it's going to be fascinating to see how it is approached moving forward. And it is certainly, I think, a bit of a change from what we see in the video game. There's also a bit of a humanization of Fedra. As I mentioned, the woman at the very beginning, telling the kid that everything's going to be okay, that they're going to get him favorite food and toys before, I mean, ultimately killing him. And then the dirty cop character is not something we have in the video game. It kind of adds a layer of consequence to kind of this violence that in the video game, Joel didn't have a relationship with any Fedra officer like he does in this show. So there wasn't this bartering that he tried to do while he's on his knees trying to get out of this situation. It adds this human element, and it makes Joel's decision to kill him all more impactful. That this is someone he knows that earlier in the day he was talking to, and now it's either him or me, and he chooses him. So this it was something that happens as a result of having a TV show, I think, where you can flesh some of this out more, and you get these types of moments where you're able to humanize people, and it adds just more impact to the choices that Joel is going to make, and Tess and Ellie are going to make throughout this series, that there are people on the other side who are going to be affected by this. And that's not always something we got to see in the game just because of the nature. I mean, in the game, you are focused as Joel for most of the game, so you don't get that type of viewpoint. In a TV show, you're going to get that type of viewpoint. You mentioned as well, this episode ends with Bill and Frank's radio playing Never Let Me Down. It's a fun little way to show Ellie's cleverness and wittiness and how smart she is for someone her age, that she opens it up, she sees this piece of paper, and she immediately cracks that it is a radio code, and then she tricks Joel into giving her the bit of information she didn't know. It's a great mechanism to see or to show us how smart Ellie is and has become in this post-apocalyptic world. Music, though, Tom, is something that plays a big role in The Last of Us, though.
Yeah, for sure. And particularly in the second game. And these are the types of changes, especially I want to talk real quick about that humanization of Fedra, which this is the type of example of, and for most of the audience, we're not getting way too in the weeds with changes that they're making from the show, even though it's important to point out interesting things they're doing when adapting the source material. This is a really good example of a small change that makes a ton of sense, that does not mess with the story in a fundamental way. This moment happens in the game where these soldiers catch Tess and Joel and Ellie, and they're scanning them, and Ellie stabs someone right as they're scanning him. But it's not someone that Joel has a relationship with. It's not anyone that we've gotten to know. It's just some random soldier that's tired of this shit. And then as soon as Ellie does that, they seize the opportunity and kill them. And they turn this moment into something way more significant and resonant, which is Joel reliving that trauma, and Ellie having this reaction to having a new protector, and Joel having to live with this consequence of this outburst of violence. He's sort of like, it seems like he's looking at his hands like, oh God, I did it again, which, maybe implies that some further previous actions that we don't know about. But it's these types of changes which have us really excited about the direction of this adaptation. It's not always going to be just a shot for shot, even though some cases they might land on the source material. They're really looking ways to flesh this out in some ways that heighten the story and the characters and the narrative experience that we're all going on. So I just think that they're doing a tremendous job with a lot of that stuff.
We have some awards we're going to give out at the end of each episode. Tom, let's get your this one is a little more straightforward this week, but we're going to have our best game moment brought to life each week, called the Baby Girl Award.
This is our baby girl.
Yes.
The sweet, precious thing that we would not change. They did it perfectly. It holds a spot in our heart, and they're like, oh yeah, that's our baby girl right there. So Jacob, I want to go to you first. What was your baby girl moment of this episode? What did they absolutely get right that you would not touch a single thing on it?
I mean, it has to be what the award is named after. It's literally the baby girl moment with Sarah's death. We spoke about the importance of it. They had to get it right. They nailed every aspect of it. I think that has to be the award this week. There's a couple other moments, but I think we named the award after it. It has to be this.
Yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and agree. That's the clear winner. It's the most impactful moment of the first episode. It's one of the most impactful moments of the game, as I said. That is the clear and obvious choice. I'm gonna just give an honorary shout out since you already took that one. The credits and bringing back Gustavo for the score. I'm so glad they're not trying to do a different score. The pensive acoustic guitar with those classic themes, it works so perfectly. I'm so glad that they're leaving that. I wouldn't touch that. I wouldn't want to make any changes or bring in a new composer. So I'm super glad they're keeping that.
The best change, it's clearly something that's going to be a constant and not for the worse in this show. But the best change they made from the video game to the TV show. Let's go with yours first. What did you think was the best change this week?
I think it's the choice to. I talked about it a little bit earlier. I think it's Joel's motivations for wanting to leave the quarantine zone. Of it not just being, all right, well, let's go do this. Let's go get some more guns so we can have more guns to sell it. It's going back to the core of his character. He's scared that his brother hasn't talked to him in 3 weeks, and he feels a desperate urge to go find him. Again, not a question for Joel. He knows exactly what he needs to do. He's got to get that truck. He's got to go get Tommy, or else he's going to be dead. Is that true? We'll find out. I'm not sure, but I think that's a much more interesting way for him to meet Ellie than to just sort of stumble upon her in his smuggling goods for guns. I think that's a much more interesting storytelling choice.
I mean, that's more or less what I had. Just kind of the Tess, Joel, Marlene type of storyline, the way they tie that all together, all of them getting in the same room and needing each other's help. I thought that was a much cleaner way. I also wrote down Joel beating the hell out of the Fedra officer is not something that is in the game, as we said, and it adds a layer of consequence and impact to the situation, and whether it is with, as you said, it seems like he's done this before, as well as Ellie's reaction to it as well.
Yeah, and they're doing a really good job of making all the people in the show feel like people. It's a very it sounds obvious. Couldn't tell you how many shows or movies I watch these days where it just like they don't feel real. I think Andor did a great job recently also of doing this. This is not an Andor podcast, but I just want to give a quick shout for that show, which was great. But yeah, I think the humanization of Fedra, those extra relationships that make sense that weren't there, those are all great changes. I want to also drop in my Molotov hot take because I realized I forgot to do it earlier. Here's my hot take. Okay, you ready? Oatmeal raisin cookies are good. What is with this slander? They're tasty. I get that maybe she didn't want one from the overly Christian lady, but I don't like this implication that maybe she survived the. Well, she didn't survive, but you know what I mean. Maybe she didn't turn into an infected because she didn't want those cookies. Oatmeal raisin cookies are good. Damn it, that's my hot take.
Look, all I'm saying is not eating oatmeal raisin cookies saved lives in this show. If you're expecting chocolate chip cookies and get oatmeal raisin, it's even worse too. So I am
Okay, but who looks at a cookie and can't tell if it's oatmeal raisin or chocolate chip? Like, you need better eyesight if that's a problem you're running into.
the MVP of the week. We'll do this for each episode. I'll give mine first. To me, I think this is a runaway. It's Nico Parker as Sarah, who, like I said, that was a very difficult character she had to play. And you have to fall in love with that character for that moment to really hit. And she absolutely nailed it. And she was absolutely fantastic in the opening 30 minutes of this episode. Hat tip to her. I don't know if this is the last we'll see of her. I would assume so, but just incredible from her.
I want to cheat so hard and name like four things, but I can't. But I'm gonna come back to Craig Mazin, and I obviously, if you're experiencing this story for the first time, your answer probably should be Neil Druckmann, just because he did this. This is his story, and he created it, and he's helping to perfect it with Craig Mazin. But for me, and for us as like fans of the story, but very interested in this show and this project and how they're adapting it and the ways they're doing it, I could not have been more impressed with Craig Mazin's fingerprints all over this episode. We mentioned that prologue. Obviously, he's making a bunch of interesting changes. He is the reason that Pedro Pascal wanted to be in it, which I very easily could have named Pedro Pascal as the MVP too. I think the Last of Us fans are in very good hands with Craig Mazin at the helm. I think they would be in very good hands even if for whatever reason Neil Druckmann stepped away. He really seems like he gets it. He gets what's important to the story, and he also has creative ideas to flesh things out. So I'm going to give my MVP to Craig Mazin.
It's a fair shout. They have absolutely hit a home run one episode in. That'll do it for the non-spoiler part of this week's episode. This is your hard line in the sand. If you don't want anything spoiled.
Well, just real quick. Sorry, I just want to say, follow us on Twitter at TLOU Nerds if you haven't already. We would love to hear from you if you're listening to the show, if you're enjoying it, if you have questions, you have thoughts, you have feedback. Feel free to give us a shout. That's the easiest way to reach us, just at TLOU Nerds. Subscribe to us. Keep listening to the pod. That helps us a lot. If you would leave us a good review, if you've enjoyed it, that would be so kind. We're still, we're very new. We're not backed on any network or anything like that. We're just two buddies that like talking about The Last of Us and are excited about this show. So any review that's positive would mean quite a big deal for us. We would really, really appreciate it. Can't wait to see you back here for episode 2. But yes, I think we've said everything we need to say on that. This is your hard line. If you do not want any spoilers from the game of The Last of Us or The Last of Us Part 2, we made a decision that all video game knowledge is fair game. Get out now. This is your final warning. Okay, Jacob, I think the first thing we need to touch on is one of the ending points for the episode, which for a segment that I want to dub the crafting upgrade of this episode. The one thing that I would maybe tweak a little bit just to see if I can make it better. We're probably nitpicking with a lot of these changes, but I want to talk about this Ellie's immunity reveal because I feel like it's maybe the one part of the episode that didn't quite fully land for me. And obviously that's for a few different reasons. They made a choice to make this more about, Joel's trauma and Ellie's fascination with that. And that's obviously a very interesting note to end on. But finding out that Ellie has bitten and was immune is a big deal. And we didn't really spend much time on it before the episode ends. I'm confident we're going to get plenty of that. But this is my one note is just spending a little bit more time on that. And again, this indication that she is the hope for a potential cure for this cordyceps infection. I think that's so fundamentally important to the story. I'm frankly pretty surprised that they got as far as they did and didn't include that tidbit. We almost nailed it exactly correct with where we were sort of guessing the episode was going to end. Of you get all the way through Austin, you get Ellie, you find out she's potentially the cure. You're on this mission to get her to the Fireflies, and like that's the mission statement for the show. I was pretty surprised they didn't have that. But what did you think about sort of that choice?
I mean, they I think pretty clearly opted for it to be a cliffhanger more than anything else. That we don't even specifically know that she's immune in the show. We just know that she was supposedly bitten 3 weeks ago, and her arm is healing from the bite mark. So it was interesting. It seems like it seems like they just simply kind of made a creative decision that we're going to leave this on a cliffhanger and address it next week, which I assume is going to be the very beginning of the episode and a lot about that. And as you said, it's going to be, I'm certain it'll be discussed. I don't disagree that for as important of a moment and just a fact that like Ellie is the cure, they didn't focus on it at all in this episode. So it is an interesting decision. I would also say, I mean, you can pretty easily in that moment in the show just be like there was panic, everybody was rushed, they were trying to get out of there, but you can also just tack on theoretically 90 more seconds, another 2 minutes to where you
Yeah.
just kind of it sets into them that she is the cure and just the weight of the situation because as it is now they take off and no one we're not even certain if Joel heard that she's the cure and immune. He seemed to be kind of in this state of realization of what he just did more than anything.
Yeah, but like that's also so a few things I want to say there. Number one, I don't think it's much of a cliffhanger. I think
Yeah.
most we didn't really talk about it too much, but I think most reasonable people could have deduced, okay, she's immune. That's interesting, or she got bit and she didn't turn. But so I don't think that's much of a cliffhanger. But then also on your last point, like that's literally what happens in the game. Is like they have that moment. It sort of plays out like it did, except for the changes we discussed. But then there's like a second a shorter cut scene, like a few minutes later, where it's like, okay, so what's going on? Like, what's the deal? And Ellie's like, they told me that supposedly, like, this is the key to finding a vaccine.
Mm-hmm.
And Joel has like a disbelief. I felt, I don't know. It's just a slightly weird choice. I'm not complaining too much. That's really just my main nitpick with the episode is I felt like the reaction. Well, granted, again, it was at 85 minutes, so they were probably like, okay, we can't make this any longer. Maybe the scene was originally included in episode 2, and they had to cut it because they mashed these together to make 2 episodes. I don't know. All I know is just that's maybe just the one thing that didn't 100% play how I would have liked it to in the premiere. But again, we're nitpicking.
There's a ton of Easter eggs in this, as expected. None made me happier than Curtis and Viper 2.
Curtis and Viper 2.
When and it didn't even like connect when she's searching for the videos, and it wasn't until you kind of see what it is that I'm so happy that that's the little Easter egg they put in there and that's the video they watch. If it's true to the game, that's going to come up later when you see a billboard for it. I think it might be in Pittsburgh. I absolutely love that. That was one of my favorite moments from the show. It's just those little Easter eggs for the people that played the game that I love so much.
Yeah, and again, like the reason, again, this is a spoiler section. We're spoiling stuff. The reason that it's such a fun Easter egg that like emotionally connected in a way that we wouldn't mention in the earlier review is Joel and Ellie later bond over these movies. We learn, and even more heartbreakingly, Ellie wanted to, the day that shit goes down at the start of The Last of Us Part 2, she tells Dina she's thinking about inviting Joel over to a movie. And it isn't until much later in the game that we understand how significant of a moment that is, that she's thinking of, okay, I'm going to try and rekindle this relationship that's been broken, and we're going to try and bond over watching the second one of these cheesy action movies that Joel loves. And that's so heartbreaking because as people that have played or know the second game, that's the night Joel dies. So Sarah watches Curse and Viper 2 with Joel on the night that Sarah dies, and Ellie's thinking about inviting Joel to watch Curse and Viper 2 on the night that Joel dies. It's heartbreaking. It's very sad. I love the little tidbit that Joel was so excited about it having the deleted scenes. I love the little joke back and forth of like, don't fall asleep, and she's like, oh, how could I? It's so riveting. And then she falls asleep. It's very little details that warmed my heart and also broke my heart at the same time. That's why we fucking love this property. It's able to do that. Absolutely loved it.
I think this episode filled in a lot of blanks from the video game. Neil Druckmann said in an interview that a lot of this stuff was things that he already was going to add to the game, but that got left on the cutting room floor of the game itself. So I don't know specifically what was like already there, but there are parts of this that were already true to the character when they made the game. I love that they played the hits like on specific dialogue parts. They didn't change it. Drugs, I sell hardcore drugs. I was so excited to hear Ellie just pointing out your watch is broken when they're in the apartment together. Like it's just those small, and they were sprinkled throughout, but it would have been easy to not have those types of moments. And the fact that there's a lot of this dialogue that they take just straight from the game, and I specifically that Ellie and Joel scene where they're waiting on Tess in the apartment. A lot of that was almost identical to that scene in the video game. So I absolutely loved that. When they're in Austin, there's a little bit of a fake out for getting T-boned. That it's how it happens in the game. It's how they end upside down. It is obviously not how it happens in the TV show, but I love that. And another homage to those that played the game. In that same scene, the Tommy help me line obviously was not in the game. Absolutely a soul crushingly great addition because it shows you that Joel feels helpless and Tommy has kind of a realization of what is happening and has accepted it, and Joel has not. So a lot of great additions, a lot of little moments paying homage to those that played the game. What else stuck out to you from it?
Couple rapid fire things. So Jimmy Cooper was like the first infected we meet in the game who just shatters through the glass door. That didn't happen because obviously they replaced that with the whole Nana thing, which I think definitely was an improvement. Those were some good choices there. But they still give Jimmy a shout out because he's the new Lewis who had the farm on fire. They said that was Lewis's farm, and now it's Jimmy's farm. So Jimmy got to glow up. He's a farmer. He's still a more qualified farmer than Ellie. We'll get into that at a later date. I love that. The Bill and Frank, obviously, this is not really Easter eggy, but just something that I'm excited about is obviously they're going to play a much bigger role. We've heard that there's a big Bill and Frank episode that is supposedly incredible coming up. I'm excited to watch what that is and how that is because again, Frank is dead in the game, and Bill is just already full Bill by the time we see him. So I'm getting the sense we're going to see more stuff. They're in trouble, obviously. That's interesting. I want to see what that is about because Bill's not in trouble when Joel and Ellie show up, and again, Bill's going to have a much different role to play, obviously, because well, actually, maybe not. So maybe so I guess they're probably going to find the Fireflies, and that truck's not going to be there. So they'll still probably need Bill for the car, is the thing, I guess. But I'm interested to see that. The Weeks Ahead trailer, oh man, it was so you could see a shot of Henry and Sam, you could see Tommy, you could see Jackson, and place shots that look like just straight out of The Last of Us 2. And most importantly, that final shot of Joel, seemingly, I'm pretty sure, in the hospital. That trailer had me super hyped. I mentioned that trailer made me way more hyped than like the legit official main trailer that came out. But I'm super interested to see a lot of that. Like you said, they did a great job playing a lot of the hits. Next episode, we can talk a little bit about what we expect there.
Before we do that, real quick, there's two more things I wanted to touch on. The line that Marlene says, was Riley a terrorist? And Ellie's reaction was fantastic, and it made me that much more excited for the Riley episode whenever that comes, because that connection is very clearly still there. Let's look ahead to next week and what we think this episode is going to be. Our kind of guess beforehand, since we already nailed the first one, was that this is them escaping Boston, getting to the Capitol building, and the ending is Tess dying. Is there anything that makes you think that's not going to be how this next episode plays out?
I think it kind of has to be. We're obviously getting a bunch of clickers, and I'm excited to see people's first time reaction to clickers because I think that everything we see is like, oh yeah, they're gonna do clickers, right? This is gonna be fun. The noises sound great. They're gonna be creepy. They're gonna be scary. And I don't think the show's like scariness is gonna be like the biggest thing of it going forward, obviously, but I am interested to see how they do some of those more horror elements. Neil Druckmann. Interested to see his spin on it as well. Yeah, no, I think they have to get to the episode. I think that's going to be, they might end it like on them setting off for Bills right after Tess dies, but I think that's almost assuredly going to be the climax of the episode is Tess revealing she's infected. Which we got a few new details on that in terms of the timeline for infection, because the poster said getting bit in the head 5 to 15 minutes to full infection, torso, arm, or shoulder or hand 2 to 8 hours, leg or foot 12 to 24 hours. And she in the show, in the game, she's been in the neck. So
it's kind of more shoulder. So, but I mean, it's just kind of
okay, right? Yeah, all right.
There's not going to be a lot of time that passes between her getting bit and revealing.
You're right. It maybe is in the shoulder, so maybe that timeline still works, right? 2 to 8 hours, because she's like, I was bitten an hour ago, and it's already worse.
Yeah.
So maybe that does actually work. Good point on the shoulder, but that was a cool little tidbit that they put just on the. And my brother was wondering if this was something that actually was straight from the game, because it kind of looks like a piece of lore that you would pick up in the game, which is one of my favorite parts of storytelling that the game is able to do that the show can't really, but it was sort of a cool little kind of homage to that. But I think it has to be different, because the line before that sticks in my head is everyone turned within 2 days, and this has clearly made the show's choice that like 24 hours is the max. Like no one's getting bitten and then not turning within 24 hours. So I think that makes sense. A 24 hours seems like a natural sort of clock for that type of thing is the maximum. But this feels like a really good spot to wrap it up. Again, if you've made it this far, thank you. We really appreciate you listening. Please follow us on Twitter at TLOU Nerds. Please review the show. Leave it 5 stars or a good review if you would be so kind. We would love to hear from you if you're listening to the show. Again, we're a very small podcast, so sometimes it can feel like we're just speaking out to the world and we're hoping someone's listening. But if you've enjoyed, we would love to hear from you. Share the pod if you know anyone else that has Last of Us, and we're getting some clickers next week, so make sure you have a brick or bottle handy. Keep those tissues there just in case. But I'm excited. This has been great. I'm really looking forward to continuing to talk about this with you, Jacob.
This is going to be fun, so I hope you guys continue to join us in this. But for Tom, this is Jacob signing off, guys. Have a great week, and we will see you next week.